Ronnie, Doris, can you see okay in that? You see all that you want to see with your eyes closed? We're not looking at the text on the left side. That's why I zeroed in on the right. But it gives you a bigger area to glance at. I didn't want to keep putting the whole Mediterranean Sea up there, but that's the right coast of it, as I call it, as in the east rather. Come join us, Cecilia. We're going to start in a minute. Need what? Well, or a cow bell or a bull horn? Why does a cow have a bell and a bull have a horn? I guess because they do. Yes, down here. If you want to see. Now, if you want to snooze, you can do like Chris Atkins and just sleep in the back there under the clock.
Let's don't start calling out that sleeping now.
Yeah. I am definite proof it is easy to fall asleep during sermons or even during preparation of sermons. So if you think you're dozing off and you're the first one, you are not.
I like to blame it on medicine.
Yeah, medicine has an impact, or didn't get enough naps in the morning, or any number of things. Tell you what I'm going to do, though. There we go. We got enough quorum now, I think, to go ahead and start class. I don't know if it's just on your side of town or mine, but I had to drive all the way around the railroad tracks to get across from Hickson. The train was parked for a long way, either which direction, so I knew it wasn't going to get out. So we might have a few more join us, but we're glad that you're here. So we're getting ready to start another part of a tour through Israel and biblical applications and things that have gone on. So,
Before you start, does that train have a specific time that it runs or
no? No, because it's just whatever. They're parked there overnight. It was. It is. I understand it's a lot longer than it used to be when they built all this system around here. I think I'll pull this too here, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started with a prayer, and Bob's going to lead us here.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful for another day that you have given us on earth. Today is the Lord's Day, and we are grateful that we have an opportunity to come together and meet as a group. May you be with David as he walks us through the places created and that is places that have such great significance to us in Christians. Be with us today and keep us safe. We ask this in the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, this is lesson number 4 in touring through Israel, for where Melanie and I had a chance to go, and some biblical applications and things that went on. And so we're doing 2 areas, Sea of Galilee and Capernaum. So just to help identify remembering where everything is on the map. If you're like me, and maybe not, first thing you do when you get your new Bible is you turn back to the back and you look at all these different maps that are on there. I pretty much disregarded those most of my life, except when I was tracking where Paul's missionary journeys were going, just to see where he kind of circled around, not to really take into account all that. But it's a lot more meaningful getting to be there and getting to see how all of these places are in close proximity to one another. And so we're looking at the east coast of the Mediterranean on the map there on the left side. And the arrow is pointed toward the Sea of Galilee, and the one on the right, same way. It gives you an idea of that shaded beige area, that's all called Galilee proper. And so all those different cities are around that area. And so the Sea of Galilee is a primary working area, but not entirely where Jesus worked. And so this is one of the most important parts, I guess, as far as his ministry is concerned, because he spent so much time in that area. Sea of Galilee is primary area for the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And Matthew chapter 8, there's a discussion about Jesus casting demons out of an individual, and there's a request for the demons to get to go into the swine. And if you remember, it says that the swine got into the pigs, and then the pigs ran off down the steep and down in the water. And people in that area feel like the picture on the left is where the Sermon on the Mount actually took place. But that's just a supposition. Nobody knows for sure. There's no signage or anything up there. And if there was, we wouldn't trust it. But the picture on the right definitely shows a nice steep embankment coming down a hill headed down into the Galilee Sea. So it gives you an impression of what's going on in all this around the Sea of Galilee. It's a beautiful area. It's 15 miles long lengthwise and 7 miles wide. And so it's a pretty good size. It's not a sea like we think of a sea. It's an extremely large lake. But it's called the Sea of Galilee. Good place to do fishing, as you realize that a lot of the discussion about fish and fishing with the apostles was all done on Galilee. Jesus walking on the sea in Galilee. And we were able to take a boat ride. This is the boat that we got on the one on the left and the right. It's just the back side and the front side. They were sure that this was the size of the boat that the apostles got in. I always have a bit of skepticism on that, how confident some of these people are, because nobody really knows. And we'll see some more pictures toward the end about some boats and all. But we all fit on this. There were 17 of us seated around the area on this boat, and a crew of 3 or 4. So it's a good-sized boat for riding around the sea. I suppose you could haul in a lot of fish and stack them in there. And so that gives you an idea of the size of a boat possibly that ran that. Now, real boat, the one on the left, was discovered in 1986. I'm going to give you some info about this. This is 2 fishermen who were brothers, Moshe and Yuval Lufan. They were amateur archaeologists, and a lot of times they would go up and down the coast just to see what they could find along the Sea of Galilee. So being amateur archaeologists and fishermen, that was the place that they would spend a lot of their time. They stumbled upon a mudded area where there was an oval shape that appeared under the muddy ground. Now, they wouldn't have seen it normally, except during the normally rainy season. It had been a pretty good drought area, not as much rain as normal, and so the sea had receded quite a bit. And so they're able to see further up under where the water normally would be at that time. So that's how they discovered this. And so they carefully dug into the mud. Archaeologists knew not to just go chopping away at it, and uncovered what people claim is one of the greatest archaeological finds in Israel's history. little skeptical about that. But nonetheless, that's their terminology and how it's written in an account about that. But it is an intact fishing boat, same kind of boat that would have been used by Jesus and his disciples. Radiocarbon dating places the wooden boat somewhere around the time of Jesus, give or take 80 years. So it could have been a little later than Jesus or even a little earlier than him. It can't be proven in any way, of course, that that's the disciples' boat. There's no graffiti on it or anything like that saying Peter was here. This is in the account that was mentioned about it. But for quite a few days, they were carefully uncovering this boat. It's 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. And tallness is kind of course, hollowed out, so it's hard to know. But it says that back in Jesus' day, 4 people would have rowed a boat such as this. And so that's what you've got on this. The big question is, after they discovered it and kind of unearthed it somewhat, how are they going to move this boat to get it without crumbling? And so the excavators decided to encase the entire wooden structure of the boat and coated it in polyurethane and then floated it to a spot where they could lift it up out of the water. After they did that, they contacted the right authorities, and the guys came along and said, "Thank you very much." Eventually, they mailed them a little certificate, and so this is in a museum in Israel, not in the main museum, but nonetheless an area where it can be seen by a lot of people. It's on display. There's discussion about the types of woods that it's made from. One of them is from a wood that's called the Judas tree, because it's supposedly what the tree that Judas hung himself on, that type of wood, not Judas's wood from his tree, but something of that nature. And so that's something about the boat. The boat on the right is a replica of what other people think the fishing boat would have looked like. Pretty well the same shape, mast, etc., in order to sail along the area. So I suppose that's the discussion on that. Now, when you think about Jesus getting in the boat with his apostles and traveling, then you've got 13 men on board. 27 feet long. Be kind of tight on that space, but who knows how big of the boats were that the apostles used in their fishing. I'm supposing that when they got into a boat, one of those was Simon's, at least at one occasion, we know. So that gives us an idea, at least as far as the boats and all go. To me, more exciting is a discovery in Capernaum. Again, back up on that coast of Sea of Galilee, I've got a little yellow arrow pointing down to the name Capernaum, and on the right side of it is a little dot where it's located, and it's right on the Sea of Galilee. It is a small fishing village. It's known to not be that wealthy, and yet it is the place that Jesus spent most of his ministry. Not all of it, but quite a bit of his ministry, and it was done in Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, along with the fishermen, etc., that were in that area. So when you go to Capernaum, there's welcome signs out there. They spell it a couple different ways in English, because you're looking to take Hebrew language and put it into English letters. There aren't English letters in the Hebrew language, and so they're giving you as best a pronunciation of how they say it. So sometimes it's the stone on the right, on the left there, it's Capernaum spelled with a PH, how we don't spell it, but nice area, plants, and other different plants, etc., that are around that area. When you go into this area of Capernaum, there's a lot of excavation that's going on because, number one, it is the primary area where Jesus did most of his ministry. And so there are a lot of biblical accounts, and we'll look at some of these. And so there's a definite connection to what went on in Capernaum and all the things that Jesus did and others that way too. So you can move through this area that's pretty much fenced off. They don't want people just going through because there's a lot of different pieces of stuff that archaeologists have unearthed, and they've placed different locations, and I'll show you some of them, that they're still figuring out where this goes and that goes from all the things that are in Capernaum. And those are some of the pieces. The one in the upper right-hand corner is anybody recognize that? Got a hole through the middle, kind of angled the millstone. And the others are just pieces. So when you go through the area, there are sections where they have, as you see on the picture on the left, there are sections where they have unearthed pieces, and they're not quite sure how it all fits together yet, but they're piecing it together to know what connects to what, as you're seeing there. So all those different ones are on that. The primary part, as you look from the area where all the pieces are surrounding the city, is straight in front. I remember looking up and seeing that building, a wall in front of us, and across the little courtyard that they had put off with stones, etc. And so you get a little closer and you see this is definitely some kind of large, important building. And so what we come upon, so we got up close, is a late 4th century synagogue, somewhere in the late 300s, built on the remains of a 1st century synagogue. A 1st century synagogue, the only one in Capernaum, which means this is where Jesus taught. This is where he went in and out. And when it talks about him opening a scroll in Capernaum, he was in this building. I want you to notice two things about it. The difference in the rock layers on this outside wall, you can see it better than if you could on the inside. And the lower level is the 1st century flooring. Stones are different. They're set in place in a different way. The ones that are 4th century are cut, etc., angled a certain way, and smaller in size. And so you can see the difference and know what the archaeologists are talking about and how they distinguish one from another. But that's what you see when you get inside. And it's just so awe-inspiring to walk into this. We came in the back door to start with and started snapping pictures in every which direction. But you can see it's a good-sized synagogue. It is the only one in Capernaum. This has to be the place where Jesus taught, and also where Peter lived in Capernaum, etc. And so you can move about the cities and you can see columns and walls that are reconstructed back with the pieces, how they fit together. They're very meticulous on being careful to put the things back where it belongs and not try just to stack it in some form and just get on with it. And so they'll take very tedious effort in making sure everything is as exactly as it would have been. When you get up a little closer to the columns, you can start to see, for those that are sitting closer, or you can zoom in a little more, you can see some carvings that are on the sides of some of the pillars in reference to people or authorities that were doing things at that time in that area. Bob?
David, I've always been curious that in Israel today, do you have a sense of the percentage of Christians versus Jews versus others? And I guess the second part of the question would be, if they're more Jewish, do they still have that great respect for the fact that this is where Jesus was?
Percentage-wise, first question is percentage, how many Christians are there in Israel? And it's not as much as you would think. And question is, and I don't know exactly that part, but do the Israelis have as much respect for all of that as the Christians do? Yes. This is what we're looking at here is their heritage. This is their synagogue, 4th century Jewish synagogue, built on top the 1st century. And so it belongs to them just as much as we would tie it into Jesus. They would tie it in to the Pharisees and everybody else, whoever was rulers at that time. And they keep very meticulous documentation on people that are in charge. I don't know of that particular synagogue. I didn't do any research at all in that direction, no, but I do know that they do keep careful notes on all those things. And so they have a tremendous respect. On the tour that we went on, there were 17 of us. There was one couple that were guiding us on this tour that have made this, I think this was their 12th time, or they've been there 12 times. He studies this stuff all the time. He goes on the archaeological digs after he goes down there, and he goes even times when he doesn't take a tour. And when he does all this, he studies and researches and checks things out, and is a member of the church in northern Kentucky. And so he takes groups. Now, along with him was an agnostic Israeli who has to be accredited by the government and have studied all of this stuff, the Antigüedades, not Spanish, sorry. What's the word in English? Antiquities, of all the things, ancient stuff that relates to the cities, documentation, and to biblical accounts, and being able to understand all the recent discoveries and all. And so the two of them back and forth were constantly giving us information about what all these were referenced to. And the Israeli had as much respect for what we were up to and what we were doing than you would think he would ever have. But very kind and very respectful to our thinking, to our teaching, and Christianity in a general way. He didn't understand maybe as specifically where we were at as far as members of the church. But this was the first time he'd ever been with Jonathan, who led our group. They were so much in sync in giving us information. I thought they'd been doing this for a long time, and come to find out at the end that did not. But very respectful to us.
What does that say on that building?
I don't know. Which? Did I go too fast? Sure.
It's interesting that the history of the New Testament church, where we are today, really is a throwback to the synagogue of the early New Testament period. If you look at some of these, you will see that even in our building structures today, they have been copied some in part of what we know historically to be the synagogues of old. If you look at this building,
The design.
you're going to see very strong similarities between what we have today and what existed 2,000 years ago.
Well, you can just see the columns that's already built in the wall here.
Right, that's kind of pointed this out. Some of the history that's been done, what we know about who we are and where we worship and how we worship is really directly related to the synagogue worship of 2,000 years ago.
And in between us of this age and at that time, early Christian churches and those that developed into Catholicism were all structured even closer to this with the columns in the buildings. And you move through some of these and you'll see great columns dividing up and holding up the ceiling just right down the middle of the buildings. It's not unusual at all to see those.
The beginning of the Church of Jesus really started as house churches, house assemblies, the ecclesia, the gathering, and but as we grew and developed, we can see what we have today is a very strong link between now.
I would say also, in addition to the house churches, at the very, very beginning, were the potential of utilizing the synagogues for Sunday morning. When they didn't, that was the Monday for them, as far as that goes. But it was Sunday for the Christians, and utilizing those buildings in addition to the house churches. Whenever you had some people that were sympathetic and allowed that to take place.
The steeples that are part of the construction of many Christian churches today in America, all of that steeples throw back to the way that the synagogue was identified in large communities back in the first century.
Right.
They would erect a pole on the top of the building that was the indicator of where the synagogue was. And so as you got into a larger city area, there would be quite a few synagogues, and the distinguishing characteristic of it being a synagogue was a pole that was sticking up in the air. People could see at a great distance. And so, hence, why the churches in America have steeples, and all throughout Europe, the pole on top of the synagogue, pointing to the highest point.
Good. Okay. Just different pieces of architecture that are related to the synagogue particularly. And then as you move about the whole area of Capernaum that's under excavation, you see that the synagogue was the main part they were trying to put together, but there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done with all the rubble, etc., around that area. Plants, etc., still growing around. I put these two on there. I mentioned the millstone at the beginning, and that's the picture on the right. And I wanted to highlight the steps that are on the left. This is not very far away from the synagogue, just a very short distance. And supposition by a lot of people is this is the place where, if you'll recall, the paralytic was carried up onto a roof and lowered down through the roof in order to get in, to have access to Jesus, because the crowd around the house was so massive that they couldn't get in to get the paralytic healed. And so these are one of, I think, just two that have steps that actually are there within the side of a building that you see that would point us toward the potential of that being the steps that the paralytic's friends raised this man up and climbed up on the roof. Just a short distance across from the synagogue in Capernaum is this, what looks like a satellite dish on top of a rubble. The satellite dish is, let me see here, I got to look at my notes here. It's an Franciscan church that built on top of a rubble home. Now the home is a first century house. They can tell by the work, etc., the graffiti that's done on it, and the carving, etc. But most importantly is that evidence points it to be Peter's house. Peter was from Capernaum. On the inside of the walls, there are paintings and graffiti, etc., decoration graffiti, not like scribbled stuff, that talk about it being the house of Peter, and the ichthus, fish. I don't remember if it was spelled out in Greek, which Greek letters ichthus means Jesus. It's an acrostic in Israeli is what I want to say, for Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. And if you put those letters together, ichthus, the word is fish. And that was a first century symbol that was used by Christians. And it was just kind of clever that the word fish fit. It had nothing to do with being fishers of men, but it fit with the signs of Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. In the latter part of the first century, the church, when they were being persecuted, and Christians would go from one city to the next, and as they'd move into the area and being unsure of who is a Christian, how are they being persecuted, would go into places like the market and have a discussion with person. And as they were talking to whoever was attending them in the market, and they realized maybe there was some kindness about that person that was different than the normal individual. And so the person might take a stick, as he'd be carrying his staff with him, and he'd draw the half portion of the fish in the dirt on the ground and keep on conversing. And if the fellow that recognized what was going on, it was a Christian, he would complete the fish shape. The first part would curve around and come down. He'd complete the second half of the fish, saying, I know who you are. Yes, I am a Christian also. And this is how they would connect secretly to Christians in different towns as they'd move about. And thus the word ichthus, or fish, became an important part. Well, that was marked on the inside of this building. There's references to it being a place of worship, and that was the house of Peter. And so it's an easy connection to realize that Peter, although he left the house and went off with the Lord, this is where he lived, very possibly. And the sad part about it is that that Franciscan church is sitting right on top of it. You don't have much view of what's going on the inside, so they keep that property. But just interesting points is that absolutely who knows. But it's definitely a first century house, very possibly the part of Peter. Now, that ends, well, let's go back to that one picture and just leave it like that. Doesn't end our discussion, just ends the pictures here. Some things in reference to what went on in Galilee and also in Capernaum. In Galilee, Isaiah 9, verse 1, reference says that, nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he, capital H-E, lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterwards more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan in Galilee of Gentiles. Prophetic passage from Isaiah referencing a location that the Messiah would come in Galilee area. John chapter 6. There's several passages. I'm starting with Galilee, and we'll get to Capernaum here. After these things, John writes in verse 1, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. So there's another term. Why would they use the word Sea of Tiberias? Who is or what is Tiberius? He was the emperor during that time. So he gets the sea that was known by the Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea's down south of that, to tie it into belonging to him, or at least named after him, to honor him. Verse 2 says that a great multitude followed him because they saw signs which he'd performed on those who were diseased. Healing, when he says signs. It wasn't that they carried signs like protest here and all, like we see on the people standing on the sides of the roads, but rather it was performing miracles, and that was a sign that God was with them, is the reference here. So Jesus goes up upon the mountain. Remember, we saw the mountains around that area, and he sat down with disciples. Okay, reference possibly now to Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, as far as the Sermon on the Mount. As it goes on, Jesus sees the multitude that's with him, throws out the question in verse 5, says, talking about they should be eating, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But he said this to test them, John writes, for he knew what he was about to do. Verse 7, Philip's response, you've read before, verse 7, 200 denarii worth of bread's not sufficient for them. Maybe that's how much they had amassed, or maybe something close to that. But just threw that out. So a little boy comes by with 5 loaves and 2 fish, a multitude of people. What happens? Jesus feeds them. This is all right there along the edge of the Sea of Galilee. So a major miracle is performed. 4,000 or 5,000 people, I don't remember which in this occasion, that are fed before Jesus, performing this miracle. Verse 16, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. So right there on that edge in John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, if you'll remember, there's quite a bit of discussion about Jesus speaking to the apostles and to the people. They are bothered by his teaching, described as a hard teaching. This is multitudes of people. And as a response to all this, they leave him. They turn away. What does Jesus say to his apostles? Go get them? Beg them to come back? What is Jesus' response to the apostles? Anybody remember? When the multitudes left after he had that hard teaching, Jesus' response to the apostles is, Do you want to go away also? So a lot of challenges issued along the Sea of Galilee here and in the area near Capernaum. The response, by the way, was, to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. And latter part of John 6. Matthew 4, verse 13, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, areas described by Isaiah as far as where Jesus is. Matthew 8, verse 5, now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him to come heal my servant. What did Jesus do? Went to his house, healed him, took care of what? Said, go your way, your servant's going to be healed. I don't need to come to your house. I'll just do it from here. Mark chapter 1, when they entered Capernaum immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and taught. Back up just a bit here. There it is. So Jesus spent time in the synagogue teaching in that area. Verse 22 says that they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. How did the scribes teach? What's the distinguishing difference between Jesus' teaching and the Pharisees and scribes? Are we awake this morning? Did you stay up late watching the World Series game? Nodding, yes.
Well, in part, the Pharisees and scribes taught the people this is what you're supposed to do. They did not live it out themselves.
Okay, so they didn't follow their own teachings, the scribes didn't. But as they taught, they always quoted more prestigious Pharisees and scribes. Rabbi so-and-so said this and that. And so they would go with that, and they also quoted oftentimes their tradition. But you remember that in the Sermon on the Mount that distinguished Jesus' teaching, at the very end it mentioned that he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes and Pharisees. He'd say, you've heard it said to you this. In other words, you've heard them say about their traditions and their teachings this, but I say to you this. And he would give an accurate interpretation, not a change in the law, but an accurate interpretation of the Old Testament. And so he was clarifying what God had originally intended for the Old Testament. Mark 2, as we mentioned earlier about the picture of the steps, Jesus heals the paralytic that was lowered down before him in the house. And Mark chapter 9, a challenge to the apostles. When it says he came to Capernaum and he was in the house, he asked them, what did you dispute about along the road? And when Jesus asks a question, he's looking for information that he doesn't know. Not at all. He's raising a question only for them to discuss it because he already knew the answer. They wouldn't want to own up to the fact. So early in their ministering with Jesus, they were already arguing over who's the best, who's the most important, who is the leader, who'd been there the longest, who did Jesus like the most. As a missionary going to Argentina years ago, there was all of these things that were swirling in our minds, and we knew what was going to happen, having talked at least to missionaries who had gone before, different teams, and studied some of the things. They talked about the great competition that the ministers would have, the missionaries and their wives. Who would have the most contacts? Who would have the first convert? Who would be the best friend to these people? Who did they like the most? And who spoke the best language? And so just think about these 12 guys that are coming out of their background. They're looking over one another who are varying in their backgrounds, much different than 5 missionaries going to a land together. And they're competing, wondering, why did Jesus ask them to be part of this group? Because they were so distinct from the others. Why fishermen? Why ask a tax man? And why, this and that? And so it just didn't make sense. So they always felt like they must be better. At least they invited them, Jesus did, to go along to keep track of the rest of them, to keep them in order, but that was not the case. So they argued, Mark 9. John 2, at the beginning of these signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and the disciples believed him. We talked about that from the passages earlier on as we were talking about Galilee. So this is the start of Jesus' ministry, done along the Sea of Galilee, walking at night as they dismissed some of the people, and Jesus, the boats had already gone out from that area. The apostles with him. Jesus was staying behind with the multitudes. They knew that he stayed and they left. And the next morning when they can't find Jesus, they go around the other side and he's over there with his apostles and they're trying to figure out, how did he get there? Because he walked on the water that night and caught up with his apostles. All that in the Sea of Galilee, right off to the edge of Capernaum. Now, as you go back to the very beginning picture with the map, this is a pretty close area. And so all these little towns along here are more like fishing towns that are along the Sea of Galilee. And so interaction among the cities and the sales, et cetera, marketplace, fishermen, et cetera, was something very common. And so it was a very smart move for Jesus to pick a place that was down to earth, that was mobile, that the discourse that worked in one town would spread immediately to the others. And so as Jesus is beginning his ministry, his fame, his ability to move from one place to another in order to be able to have an impact and it be felt in the other areas was extremely valuable for him. And so as he begins his work in Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, all the other towns are immediately starting to hear about it because there's a lot of communication among the different little cities. And so when he goes to the next place, he's already known about before he even arrives there. You go into the small town and you're going in with a group of men and they're wondering, they've not seen pictures of you, could this be? And then he starts healing, and yes, it is. And so it was a very concentrated effort that Jesus makes to make an impact. Interesting is, if you go back to the beginning and you look at the overall picture of everything, in this area is the same concentrated area that goes back to the times before Jesus' time, where God's people of Israel moved about in that area. Capernaum itself is an ancient town. We mentioned before, if you look, I guess on the map on the right, where you can see Galilee a little bit better in the arrow, you move straight east to the city that's on the coast of the Mediterranean, and you're coming to Carmel, Mount Carmel in that area. Remember, we talked about that before. It's north of, let me see if I can get my little pointer going. There's Carmel here, and it's north of Caesarea. We're looking at somewhere around, in this distance here, about 17 miles. Remember the aqueducts that we talked about that went from Mount Carmel, fed fresh water from the springs of Mount Carmel down to Caesarea, that are put in there by Herod, who was honoring Caesar in building that massive city before the time of Christ. Now, if this is 17 miles here, how close are these little cities on the coast and Sea of Galilee? Remember now, Galilee itself is only 27 miles long. So we're not talking about a large area in all these different places where he goes. I'm excited to get to come down to below Capernaum there on the side. South of that is Gennesaret. Remember, there was the healing of a man who had demons there. And then right below that is Magdala. And we went to both those areas, but Magdala is just incredible. I'll leave that hanging because it looks like it's past time for our bell to ring, so we'll stop right there. But some unique things. Any questions as we wrap up here?
What was that like for you to walk where Jesus?
It just was thrilling. To walk in that synagogue and just think, Jesus stood here. This is where he did his ministry. The synagogue was about the size of this auditorium. And you just visualize the columns on one end. Might have been a little longer, a little less narrow. I can't recall exactly. But it was just thinking, be neat to be able to preach here one Sunday. Or any day of the week, that matter. And on the Israeli steps, too, alongside the wall, going up there, knowing that this is where Peter had preached. And we'll look at that at some time down the road. But all of those things, it's such a neat feeling. And see, it's just done right there at that area. And God's still working in areas like this, too. Okay, let's close out with a prayer, and then we'll dismiss before services. Father, thank you for moments to remember where Jesus walked and the value that he had among the people there and what he's done for us. We praise you, God, for caring enough to send your Son to do all of that. Help us to reflect on it and take it into our hearts. And may it change us to be more like Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.